So one of those things was we lost a bunch of IT staff during that key period where we really, really needed more IT staff. And similarly, we lost some library staff and we really needed the digitalisation of more and more resources during that period.
Part of what we need to do is to cultivate that sense of belonging, that sense of being together, that sense of collective obligation to one another.
Another reason why I wanted to start an official podcast is because I've been hearing the entire time I worked for the branch that people didn't want to drive to Youngstown for a union meeting. So I wanted to find a way to bring the union meeting, or at least parts of it, to the membership.
Every pilot in that class had a story about when they had fatigue event or had a fatigue flight and how they reported it and what happened. And it was a great sharing experience.
We'd look at the point, seeing boats coming around the point, or a packer. We're going to get busy, I tell the ladies. They nod their heads. Sure enough, early next morning, the Chinese boss goes, there's a big stick and he's hitting our doors. Get up, you got to go wash fish.
You're listening to the Labor Radio Podcast, weekly produced by the Labor Radio Podcast Network, laborradionetwork.org. I'm Chris Garlock. On today's show, the RMIT Strike, 1,000 days without an agreement, stick together reports from Australia. Then, on the Dig podcast, a discussion of international solidarity with Jeremy Corbyn and Laleh Khalili. Next, some podcast solidarity as the Classes of Mail podcast features a conversation with Fred Woodley from the Delivering Solidarity podcast. Then, of special interest to anyone who's planning to catch a plane anytime soon, contractual fatigue rights and protections on the Fly-By-Night FDX ALPA podcast. And in our last segment, conversations with women from British Columbia's once thriving fishing industry from On the Line, Stories of BC Workers. That's all ahead on this week's edition of the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly. But first, let's check in with Harold on some of the other shows we're tracking this week.
Thanks, Chris. Harold Phillips here again, folks, with some shows you should know for the week of August 11th. And hey, before I get started, are you looking for the latest labor radio shows and podcasts? Now, hopefully you subscribe to all the Labor Radio Network podcast shows, but if you're looking for the latest episode, check out the feed at laborradionetwork.org. Now let's get into some of the episodes that Chris and Patrick couldn't get into this week's weekly, but you should still give a listen to. Mike looks at Tim Walz joining Kamala Harris's campaign, Mississippi Nissan workers considering unionizing, chip factory workers struggling to survive, and more on labor force. Madison Labor Radio looks at UW nurses demanding better family leave, a rally for democracy in Madison, the NEA's staff struggling against the union, and more. Rusty looks at the tradition of 2 weeks' notice and what the future might look like with increased employer investment in their employees on the wealthy Ironworker. Working Voices features a preview of the LA Workers' Party conference, Sean O'Brien's continued grief over speaking at the RNC convention, the aftermath of the East Palestine disaster, and more. And Greg challenges Elliot to a mock informal Step A meeting with a real case and reveals what could have made the case stronger on the Workroom Floor. That's it for this week, but if you want to find more labor radio shows and podcasts, follow us on social media at Labor Radio Net. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Harold. Here's the show.
G'day, Giselle Hanna here for this week's edition of Stick Together, the only national program focusing on union news, workers' stories and social justice issues from a union perspective. This program is produced in Melbourne for 3CR and the Community Radio Network on the stolen lands of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Vocational workers at RMIT University took strike action once again from Thursday the 25th of July to Wednesday the 7th of August over management's refusal to negotiate a new EBA which expired 2.5 years ago.
So now we are joined by rank and file RMIT NTU member Tammy Gadir to contextualize the industrial action that Liam was talking about in relation to worker solidarity with Palestine as Israel escalates its genocidal campaign of bombing and starvation in Gaza. So good morning, Tammy. Thank you for joining us today and for, bringing more context to the discussion that we're having.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I guess we can start off by hearing a little bit about what you do at RMIT and the context within which you have decided to participate in the strike.
Sure. So I'm a lecturer at RMIT. I started working there in 2019, about a year before the pandemic hit. And my job changed quite dramatically, as many people's did during the course of the lockdowns in Melbourne and Naarm. And one of the things that was clear to me was that while work was already quite pressured and there were particular agendas that management were pushing with regard to moving more and more things online, making things more and more readily available to students, which I agree with, but which also meant that we weren't getting the resources we needed to be able to make that happen as teachers, so more and more labour was being pushed on us. That accelerated dramatically during the period of the lockdowns. And unfortunately, the way that the university responded to that was, instead of providing us increased support, they actually cut services that we really required to be able to effectively move things online. So one of those things was we lost a bunch of IT staff during that key period where we really, really needed more IT staff. And similarly, we lost some library staff and we really needed the digitalisation of more and more resources during that period. So that's just an example of the way that a lot of the pressures that already existed increased quite dramatically during that period and haven't ever really gone away since we've reopened. In fact, on the contrary, I would say that due to voluntary redundancies followed by mandatory redundancies, followed by people just deciding to leave because of the pressure, the people who are remaining, our workloads have become completely unmanageable, and our wage stagnation, unfortunately, has continued, as you said, 3 years of sitting around waiting for a wage rise and not getting one, to not reflect that increased workload that we're doing. So we're all very pressed. We're all working more hours than we're paid. And for me, that's a big reason why I'm striking, and it genuinely affects the quality of my work. I can't be the best person I can for my students, and that's why I'm there. So that's very sad to me.
Yeah, 100%. So thank you so much, Tammy.
Thanks for having me.
That was 3CR's Priya speaking with striking RMIT vocational worker Tammy Gadir. My name's Giselle Hanna. Remember, wherever you are, whatever you do, there's a union for you. And until next time, stick together.
Hey, this is Carmen Rodriguez from El Desvío. At LACLA, we are proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, with more than 200 labor radio shows and podcasts from across the country and around the world. The Labor Radio Podcast Network, where working people speak. Find us at laborradionetwork.org.
Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This episode, however, is from London. It's my interview with Jeremy Corbyn and Laleh Khalili, conducted just over a week ago in front of a live audience, packed into Islington's beautiful Union Chapel. We discussed the history and present of internationalism and the left, emphasizing Palestine solidarity, but also extending our conversation well beyond it.
The Attlee government is the most contradictory thing there ever was in British history. Very brave and very innovative on economic and social policies within the UK in the sense of the National Health Service, council housing, planning, public ownership, Town and Country Planning Act, all of those things that were so essential to the changing the lives of so many people in post-war Britain. But its international policy was appalling. At the same time as promoting all this social justice at home, They were conniving with colonial forces in Vietnam to shut the Viet Minh up and using Japanese prisoners of war to shoot Vietnamese people in order to stop them gaining independence until the French colonialists could come back. They did the same in Indonesia. They did the same in Malaysia. They did the same in attacking the independence movements in Kenya. And so it's that contradiction that's there. So within the Labour Party and the Labour movement, there's always been this huge debate. And we were talking earlier, just before we came in, about the role of Fenner Brockway and people like that in the Labour movement who stood up for a genuine internationalism, and those that basically saw the whole thing as a Cold War tool. And so I've always found it very hard to argue for genuinely international positions within the Labour Party and the Labour movement. And it's the area that I suffered the greatest attack for being leader of the party wasn't the economic policies that we were advocating. They didn't like them, but they could sort of live with them. What they couldn't live with was the idea that you would have somebody in government who said from the very outset they're never going to use nuclear weapons, and they wanted to dismantle international military alliances and instead always search for peace, justice, and examining the causes of war. And that, in a sense, what goes on now. It still goes on today.
Where actually, when you look at the world, the real international community, the vast majority of the billions of people that are often under the boots of states that are often the allies of the United States and United Kingdom, that vast majority of people have a completely different conception of our relationship to one another across the different borders. And I think part of what we need to do is to cultivate that sense of belonging, that sense of being together, that sense of collective obligation to one another, particularly at this moment where, with the climate crisis and with the increasing violence of the states against all the ordinary people, certainly in Palestine, but we're seeing it also in Kenya. I think Assad mentioned that earlier. We're seeing it in Bangladesh. We're seeing it in a lot of the rest of the world. With this increasing violence, with the climate crisis, we really do need to build a solidarity from below that challenges that idea of an international community which is sitting in Washington, D.C. or in the United Nations building. The other thing that I want to mention is that I think Jeremy's absolutely right, that there is always a tension between in all the left, in all of the global north, between a kind of a nationalist left that wants to focus on bread and butter issues within its own small, somewhat provincial kind of domain, and a more internationalist left that sees our fates as interconnected. And that's always been the case, both the unions and the left parties. And I think what has been really important is that resistance from the global south has been often the factor, the catalyst that has pushed forward this, the possibility of a left arising. And I think we cannot underestimate the extent to which Palestinians' resilience, strength, and resistance has been necessary in the building of solidarity across the globe. So I think that's a point that I really want to draw out.
Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine.
Hey, this is Judy Ansell from the Heartland Labor Forum. We're radio that talks back to the boss, and we're proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network with more than 200 labor radio shows and podcasts from across the country and around the world. The Labor Radio Podcast Network, where working people speak. Find us at laborradionetwork.org.
You're listening to Fly By Night, a podcast by FedEx pilots for FedEx pilots. Brought to you by the FedEx Master Executive Council of the Airline Pilots Association. And now, here's your host, MEC Communications Chair, Captain Chris Lee.
Back with me today is Scheduling Committee Chair, Captain Marty Harrington. Thanks for coming back, Marty.
Thanks, Chris.
Since we're talking about fatigue, I've asked Fatigue Risk Management Committee Chair, Captain Rob Bassett, to join us. Rob, can you remind the pilots about our contractual fatigue rights and protections?
Chris, thanks. When you talk about contractual fatigue rights, you can get into the CBA in Section 12, but on my website, I break it down and summarize so that it's a little easier to understand. There's a section there of how to call out fatigue, and then there is some information about fatigue after pay-wise. In terms of protections, all reports are de-identified and reviewed by only 2 company fatigue reps and 2 ALPA pilots. There have been 0 punitive actions in the last 12 years. Our original tracking of fatigue events were via the irregularity report and the WBAT system, but that ended in 2017, and we have an in-house fatigue reporting system. Again, de-identified, and we use those reports to identify systemic issues and give those back to Marty to create parameters.
Well, do you see a correlation in the amount of and the uptick in revisions towards fatigue calls and reports?
Our fatigue events in 2017 to 2019 were 10 to 15 on average per month. During COVID, they went a little higher just because of our schedule was changing a lot. So there's a correlation there. And now with the increase of revisions, we are seeing an increase to fatigue events, but you really can't nail that as the reason. I like to say, and Pat, the HF team last year, they really focused on fatigue, making it personal and informing the pilots of the options and sharing their fatigue events, because every pilot in that class had a story about when they had fatigue event or had a fatigue flight and how they reported it and what happened. And it was a great sharing experience. And I think that carried forward because when we looked at fatigue events and fatigue reports, we saw a lot of the times, about 50% of the time, pilots had just had that HF class.
But Rob, you've also done a great job and spent a lot of time and effort expanding the fatigue education that's available for FedEx pilots.
Yes, we have published multiple articles, I think 20 in the last 2 years online, covering everything from buyer beware, back when pilots were picking up a lot of extra pairings because those pairings have not been vetted by your SIG, PSIT, and FRMG, to articles about culture and regulations. And in that culture article, we talked about the ratio, which was extreme, between first officers and captains and new hires. Well, relatively speaking, those have been on property 6 to 8 years versus those who've been here for a while. And I'd like to say that we just did another analysis, and those have evened up. It's pretty much at 50% captains versus 50% FOs, calling out fatigue, and about the same for filing reports.
So it was an interesting discussion we had at your quarterly meeting today, Rob. Why? Why have we seen this uptick? And it could be from a number of reasons. One is just the educational aspect.
Definitely. And it's very important that if you want to or need to, there is fatigue information available on the FDX.ALPA.org website under my committee. There also is some on PFC. There is some in your iPad. All of that is there for you to get an idea of how to call out fatigue and the pay repercussions of calling out fatigue.
Well, Rob, Marty, thanks for coming. And thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please go to our website, fdx.alpa.org, and utilize the DART link. And as always, be safe out there, and we'll see you next time.
Hey, this is Mike Strukin from the Labor Force Podcast. I'm proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, with more than 200 labor radio shows and podcasts from across the country and around the world. The Labor Radio Podcast Network, where working people speak. Find us at laborradionetwork.org.
Hold the fort, for we are coming. Union hearts be strong.
Welcome to another edition of On the Line, the podcast that shines the light on BC's rich labor heritage. I'm your host, Rod Mickleborough. In this episode, we bring you the first of a two-part series on the role of women in BC's once thriving fishing industry. Using both historical and present-day interviews, we hear from women who toiled in the fish canneries that once lined the west coast of BC and on the fish boats themselves. Work in the canneries was seasonal, it was taxing, and once the fish started pouring in, the hours were long. Needing the money, few spoke out against their working conditions. But one woman who was not afraid to speak out was Josephine Charlie. She was interviewed in 1978 by Sarah Diamond. Josephine Charlie was a member of the Squamish Nation. Mostly, she filled cans. But when things got busy, and they often got very busy, she was ordered to help out wherever labor was needed.
Pretty soon we'd look at the point, seeing boats coming around the point, or a packer. Oh, we're going to get busy, I tell the ladies. They nod their heads. They know what busy was in English. Sure enough, early next morning, the Chinese boss goes, there's a big stick and he's hitting our doors. Get up, get up. You got to go wash fish. I don't know who's washing fish. Got to fill cans. Up there 8 o'clock. We all get up, hurry in the morning. He's there 5 o'clock, pounding our doors. That's the start, the very start of the canning season. Then we're all ready. The washers rush over to the cannery, got their brushes, the oil aprons. You got to have a uniform and a bonnet.
And did you have to buy your own uniform?
No, the cannery supplied it, but you had to keep it clean yourself. They wouldn't allow you to dress the way you are. But we never wore boots, never did. That's one place I never wore gumboots in that cannery. It was dry inside that cannery. Of course, it had big cracks on the floor. Any water would go down, you know. And the washers hurry up, Chinese, Indian woman, older woman, and some teenager Indians.
It was tough manual work that had to be done quickly with no mistakes.
They would be waiting there with our knives. I always have a file to sharpen my knife. I'd have 2, 3 knives. And pretty soon the fish would come. They'd bring it in boxes and they lay it before you where you're standing. And I was very small and light then, and I was too short for the trays that you put down to put your cans that's full. So I always wore spike heels, very high heels. And I could use them from 8 o'clock to midnight, never tired me. I was so short, I couldn't reach those trays. We go by piecework, you know. And the washers are done long ago because there isn't that much. No machinery at all.
All hand.
All hand. The washers, once cutting the heads, chopping the heads, and then the fillers. Just when it goes on the line women are all there inspecting what the cans that's going, they're all right. But these women that fill cans up there are first class. They just get the right weight. I had to be like that. I had to get the right piece. And they told me, you wouldn't like to buy a can that's full of craps and that, they told me, not filled good. So every can was perfect. So we get up at 5 and we all run to the pack warehouse and we start boxing the sockeye, box it all up, and the longshoremen come and they start bring them in those luck trucks. And then next we get to the pinks, that's the humps. They're 1 pound towels. We start boxing all those. Then the whistle blows, 7 o'clock. The washers run in and start washing fish. And then some have to go help them. 8 o'clock, the whistle blows, and we leave what we're boxing, we run to fill cans. Sometimes it's sockeye or That's quarter pounds. And we got an inspector. She was an Indian woman. She was very old, but so strict, she wouldn't break a smile. I said if she ever smiled, her face would crack. She had to, you know. She wouldn't give us nobody anything at all, you know. She'd be real strict.
This episode of On the Line was produced by John Mabbitt and the BC Labour Heritage Centre. I'm your host, Rod Mickelborough. We'll see you next time on The Line.
This is Elise Bryant from the Labor Heritage Power Hour. We're proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, with more than 200 labor radio shows and podcasts from across the country and around the world. The Labor Radio Podcast Network, where working people speak. Find us at laborradionetwork.org.
All right, that is going to do it for this week's edition of the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly. Just a small sample of the amazing programs aired over the last week or so on more than 200 labor radio and podcast shows. They're all part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, shows that focus on working people's issues and concerns. We've got links to all the network shows, laborradionetwork.org. You can also find them. Use the hashtag LaborRadioPod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, you can be part of the network and you don't even need a microphone. Labor Radio Podcast Network t-shirts are now available. They're union made. You'll find them in all sizes and 2 colors at laborradionetwork.org. This podcast is recorded under a SAG-AFTRA collective bargaining agreement. The Labor Radio Podcast Weekly was edited this week by Patrick Dixon. I produced the show. And our social media guru, as always and forever, is Mr. Harold Phillips. For the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly, this has been Chris Garlock. Stay active and stay tuned to your local Labor Radio Podcast show, and we will see you next week.